Hello lovely people, my name is Emma and today we're going to be chatting about history books for world history. So I've been doing a little bit of a sort of mini series about various history books that I've read set in different countries for my Around the World in 12 non-fiction challenge, which I am doing. I have one on British history in general and then one on Victorian/Georgian history, and now we're branching out of the UK and looking at world history. This is going to look at everything apart from Europe. I'm going to be doing a separate video on European history, and so hopefully there's going to be a nice broad smattering around. I don't have as much variety as I would like. That is the point to the challenge, but we're going to jump in and have a little look at what we've got to talk about. The first book I wanted to discuss is quite short, and this is Hiroshima by John Hersey, or Hershey potentially. This originally was a sort of long form journalism piece that then got rewritten and republished as a small book. As you can see, it's quite thin and it is considered like a modern classic, and it is John's experiences going to Hiroshima after the bombings and seeing the devastation caused by the nuclear bombs. It is an incredibly harrowing account of an incredibly terrible time in world history, but it is something which I think is very, very important to read. I read this years ago and there are certain scenes from it that still haunt me to this day, so it's an incredibly important part of our history. And like I say, it's not very long, so it might be an interesting way of getting into history and into world history a little bit more if you're somebody who doesn't dabble in non-fiction particularly. The next book I wanted to talk about is The Great Leader and the Fighter Pilot, Escaping Tyranny in North Korea by Blaine Harden. Annoyingly, I can't find our copy in the house. This was such an incredible read. It was recommended to me by my husband and is looking at sort of the reign in North Korea within the 20th century and sort of the war between North and South Korea, but then specifically about a fighter pilot who became infamous for flying one of the North Korean jets basically over the boundary and then surrendering it to the Americans, kind of accidentally, as it all kind of happened. So it follows this sort of macro look at the politics of what was happening and then the micro look at this gentleman's life. I read this quite a few years ago now, so some of the details are a little bit hazy, but I do remember it being incredibly gripping, and it really reads like sort of a thriller style book. I really enjoy the dual timeline aspect, or kind of the dual, I guess, focus aspect, because they are basically the same timeline and time period, but sort of the look at the bigger and the smaller parts of it. It's very well written and it has a real good pace to it, so incredibly interesting book. The next book I wanted to talk about is The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee, Native America from 1890 to the Present by David Treuer. This I read for one of the BookTube prizes a good couple of years ago now, I think in 2020, and it is a chunky boy, but it is totally worth the read, and is a little bit of what it means to be Native American in America, and sort of trying to refute some of the ideas that are put forward in Bury My Heart, The Wounded Knee, which is sort of where the name comes from. Each chapter focuses on a slightly different aspect, and we get a history lesson of Native American sort of presence in America and their sort of fights for their own freedoms and rights, and then also focus on a modern day person and sort of what it means to be Native American now. Like I say, a bit of a beefy book, but totally worth it, and there are definitely some standout chapters. I really like the one that discussed sort of foraging as a lifestyle and the way that you can sort of and like as a career, and how you can make money from foraging, the different aspects and sort of the knowledge of the land. Really, really interesting, and so important to hear voices from marginalized groups, like their own stories rather than other people coming in and telling the stories, if that makes sense. Sticking in America, the next book I'm going to talk about is The Radium Girls by Kate Moore. This is a look at the women who worked in various factories basically painting the watch dials with radium paint, which would make them glow, and then in doing so they were ended up exposed to vast quantities of radium, including putting it in their mouths to sort of get the point to the paintbrushes, and then the sort of untold horrors that happened to their bodies due to the radium poisoning. This is sort of one of the earliest examples of workers' rights and workers' compensation, and the fight that these women went through to try and get, you know, their medical bills paid, to try and get conditions changed, to try and get compensation for the sort of exposure that the worker put them through, both knowingly and unknowingly at different stages in sort of the history. It is a really interesting look at sort of early 20th century, I think, America, and sort of the way that workers' rights have developed over the years, and these women sort of, and women's rights again in the workplace. It is definitely a riveting story, and Kate Moore writes it with so much sort of heart and sympathy for these women, and it's truly horrifying what they actually went through. And then my final book that is set in America, before we start to branch out a little bit more again, is Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments by Saidiya Hartman. This is such a wonderful lyrical non-fiction writing that I think really refutes the idea that non-fiction is very bland and boring and can't be beautiful and poetic in its own right. It is a very narrative style, and it basically looks at black women in the 20th century century in America and a lot of the queer communities in 20th century in America, and just sort of a snapshot of their lives and what their experiences were. It very much is a social history of those couple of decades, and it is just stunning. It's so difficult to articulate. It's the kind of thing that you could easily remove the back and claim that this was literary fiction, and I think people would totally believe it. It just had the most wonderful, gorgeous writing style, and it's such a lovely history of small things and history of sort of people's lives, rather than looking at these big macro events always, and really just giving you a snapshot into a different time period and a different culture to what you necessarily know. So really enjoyed it for that reason. We are leaving America now finally to talk about Sea People by Christina Thompson. This is in search of ancient navigators in the Pacific, and is basically look at Polynesian history and the Polynesian islands. This again I read for one of the BookTube prizes, and it is phenomenal. I think it might have won that round. It is just a stunning look at a completely different culture that I really didn't know anything about. There was a really interesting look at the languages of sort of the Polynesian islands, the various different theories for how they navigated, and then a look at sort of the various interactions they've had with invaders and crusaders and people like that in the past. So yeah, really detailed, really interesting, and completely snapshot into something I didn't know anything about before. The next book is Silver, Sword and Stone by Maria Arana. This is a look at South America and Latin America in 3 extraordinary lives, and it basically focuses on, we cover Peru, Cuba and Bolivia, and it focuses on different people in each one of those as like a snapshot to then look at the history of that country, and then in doing so looks at history of Latin America in general. It's a fairly big undertaking with that. I did really enjoy it because again, Latin America is something that I don't know much about, and I think as a starting point to kind of jump off to an incredibly sweeping broad history of the continent, it was very powerful and very well done. I do think, however, it potentially bit off more than it could chew, because that's just such an insanely broad thing to be able to try and talk about. And whilst it was trying to be structured around the ideas of silver, sword and stone as sort of the 3 kind of themes that have carried Latin America through, I think it did struggle in places to kind of keep that momentum going. But deeply interesting, so much detail in this, and yeah, definitely going to improve your knowledge of Latin America if, like me, you know bloody nothing about the continent, and it is definitely inspired me that I want to go on and read more in this area. I think I enjoyed the Cuban one a bit more, just sort of from personal preference, but all 3 sections were really good. And then the final book is a very broad, and I was supposed to be focusing on books that were just on one individual country, but I think it would be remiss not to mention The Prisoners of Geography by Tim Marshall, again, which our physical copy, I don't know where it is in the house anymore. Tim Marshall's becoming a bit of a powerhouse when it comes to books about geopolitics, and this book was one of the first that sort of made his name in this area. He's gone on to write, I think, 5 or 6 other books now. My husband's a huge fan of him, and has read nearly everything he's written. But basically, Prisoners of Geography looks at a couple of individual countries, and then looks at sort of the reasons why they are always going to be stuck in the similar kind of conflicts that they are, based on the sort of literally geological landscape, and then sort of what it means to be like bordering on different countries and the kind of skirmishes that have occurred. It was written quite a while ago now, so it'd be really interesting to look back and see how things have changed in the political landscape that he kind of predicted based on some of the information there. And like I say, he does have another book out that does a couple more countries. He's got one that's literally just come out talking about space, and he's got some that are in more specific areas. There's one called, I think, Shadowlands, that Andy said that I should totally read, that I'm pretty sure is about the Falklands, so that is on my list of something that I want to try and get to. But incredibly accessible writing style, and again, by taking them as individual sort of chapters and countries, you can almost treat it as like a collection of essays, and you can kind of jump in and out with the areas that you're interested in if you don't want to do the whole book. So those are some world history books that I would totally recommend. Have you read any of these, and do you have any recommendations myself or for me? You know what I meant there. Have a wonderful reading week, and I'll chat to you soon. Bye.